Alright, let's talk about sex. Hi, I'm Andrew Rodriguez, and welcome to Psycho Bible, babbling about psychology and theology. And today I'm excited to do some commentary on a book that I read earlier this summer, and I've been recommending to a lot of my clients and other people to check out. The Sex Talk You Never Got, Reclaiming the Heart of Masculine Sexuality by Sam Jolman. First heard about this from an interview on the Husband Material YouTube channel that Drew Boa did with Sam Jolman discussing the book. It was a great interview. I watched it several times. It's just, there's so much in it that resonated with me that basically echoes how I am with my clients, the therapy approach that I take, the perspective that I have on my channel that I've been trying to get out there to the world. And so to see it in a book form and get a little more of a larger audience, because he's connected with Husband Material, he's connected with Dan Allender, Adam Young, some of these bigger names out there. Getting his work out there is pretty much what I feel like is getting my same perspective out there. So I just want to add some commentary to it because and show how what he's saying overlaps so much with what I've been learning and I've been teaching from things like Theology of the Body, as well as Nicolosi and reparative therapy and reintegrative therapy. So let's get into it. Now, first off, this book is written to men and it's about masculine sexuality, but I actually would highly recommend it for anyone, men and women. And whether you're dealing with heterosexual porn struggles or other form of sexual brokenness, or if you're dealing with same-sex attraction or same-sex eroticization, it's going to be a book that's broad enough that I think it's going to be helpful for a lot of people. It's basically is casting a vision for what is sexuality and really what is sexual maturity. So, as I've mentioned in a previous video, the approach I take is different from, say, your typical discipleship ministry or a purity culture approach to dealing with sexual struggles, but rather one of sexual integration and maturation. So a book like this is needed because we need a corrective to the deficient or even warped education on sex and sexuality that most men receive in their formative years. And as they grow up into adulthood, these messages are still out there, whether from the world telling you sex is just about your pleasure or it's just a way of showing affection to someone and basically it's a way to manipulate and get what you want, it's just a drive. It's just something every man has needs, and so the world just presents this model that we're animals, and that boys will be boys, guys will be guys. They'll just, it's locker room talk. It's excusing men, or at least devaluing men by presenting this idea that they can't help themselves. They're just sexual, and they just have these urges, and they just need good outlets for it. So that's kind of the message we get from the world. And then, sadly, from the church, we also get a version of that, in that, well, we're depraved, and your sexual desires, they're just your sin nature coming up and manifesting itself. And you just need to suppress it. You need to, they might not use these terms, but essentially what they're telling people is to white knuckle it and cut themselves off from the goodness of their sexuality. So some correctives are really needed. And Sam Jolman, he's got 20 plus years of counseling experience. He's trained under Dan Allender, who does story work. And I go back with Allender in that when I started up my support group for guys on campus at University of Valley Forge back in 2008, one of the books I read to help prepare me for that was Dan Allender's The Wounded Heart. And that's where I got a lot of my education on what shame is and how it manifests, and to work through sexual abuse and sexual trauma. So I haven't done more training with Dan Allender, but I really do value the approach that he offers. And those who have trained with Dan Allender, they use what they call a story work approach. So you see this with Sam Jolman, Adam Young, Jay Stringer, a lot of the guys from Husband Material, the different coaches, Drew Boa. So they they approach sexuality, they approach your sexual sin with curiosity to see how it relates to your story. And that's a very valuable approach. It overlaps quite well with what we do in reintegrative therapy. So Sam begins his book by blessing men's sexuality. He asserts that men have neglected and abandoned their sexuality. Now, at a surface level, this may seem like self-evidently false, given the saturation of pornography, promiscuity, sexual objectification in our culture. You know, our culture is so obsessed with sex. But the reality is, we may be obsessed with sex, but we're not sexually mature. So Sam makes a strong case for how men's authentic sexuality is actually malnourished and uncultivated. Being sexual is not the same as being sexually mature. To reach sexual maturity, Jolman argues that men's sexuality needs to be mothered and fathered. Mothered meaning that it needs to be nurtured, cared for, and fathered meaning that it needs to be called forth, recognized, and blessed, confirmed, so that men will understand that sexuality is underpinned by our capacity for beauty, sensuality, and love. In the absence of proper sexual formation, men's sexuality becomes malformed. It needs to be acknowledged, healed, and freed. Freed to actually be utilized for the purpose that God created it for. Jolman purports that all men have pushed their sexuality into the shadows to some degree, hence the need to bless one's sexuality. It says, to bless is to behold something or someone, to tell the story, to give the good a name. A blessing nurtures, grows, shapes, and affirms. It helps some part of you become more fully alive. This is all just in the introduction. Like, I kept highlighting this book, so it gets to the point where the highlighting becomes pointless because it's all yellow. But after this introduction, Jolman declares to the reader that you, the reader, is fundamentally a lover. He never quotes John Paul II or other people who teach theology of the body like Christopher West, but this is theology of the body language right here. God made you to be a gift, an unrepeatable, irreplaceable, indispensable gift of life-giving love, as Christopher West always says at the end of his podcast. And that's the truth, that if you're meant to be a gift, that means you are meant to be a lover at your core. God is love, and we're made in His image. The core of a human is to love. And so therefore, we were designed to be moved by beauty. And beauty is deeper than mere appearance. When we've taken in the essence of a thing, then and only then have we beheld its beauty. The capacity to take in the true and full beauty of a person is the foundation of sexuality. This is right from Karol Wojtyła, who later became Pope John Paul II, his book, Love and Responsibility, in which he said that love, integrated love, is to love a person, not the parts of a person, not just their sexual attributes or sexual values, but to love the person. And by person, he means the integration of the body and the soul, the material and the immaterial aspects of that person becomes, well, that's essentially what a person is. A person is to indicate that there's a rich inner life in someone. They're more than just a body, a physicality. There's a whole realm of depth to a woman, to my wife. When I love my wife, I'm not loving just her body. I do, but I go beyond her body to see the totality of who she is. That is loving her as a person, taking in her true beauty. This makes her so uncomfortable, but I can look into her eyes for forever. I always joke around with her. I'm like, baby, just give me like 8 hours. 8 hours just staring into your eyes. And she's like, no, we're not going to do that. But that's the truth. I can be so captivated by her. And so that's taking in the full essence of who she is. We're called to that. And if we're honest with ourselves, We all long for that. That's what we desire deep down in ourselves, to be seen in that way. To receive beauty in all its fullness, God gifted humanity with senses. Because we are body-spirit composites, the way we interface with reality is through the senses. What you see, touch, feel, hear, taste. And look at Scripture throughout. Taste and see that the Lord is good. John and the different Peter in their epistles talk about how we testify to what we have seen, what we have heard. They're using their senses to tell their story. Society, both the secular and the church society, mistakenly equate sensuality with sexuality. But they are distinct. I mean, sexuality is actually nested within sensuality. Sensuality is essentially our capacity to give and receive pleasure through the senses, through what we see, hear, taste, smell, touch, everything involved with that, with our body, our senses, with the capacity to behold beauty. So we see here that our senses are meant for more than survival, but also for delight. He uses the example of the taste buds. Yes, we do need taste buds to taste if something is rotten, or if it's ripe, if it's still good to eat, healthy to eat. But so many of our taste buds are just for the purpose of pleasure, of enjoyment. He says, much like taste buds, the design of our genitalia stands as witness to the fact that God cares about our pleasure. Recent research found that men have around 8,000 nerve endings in their genitalia, in the dorsal nerve of the glans penis, and women have around 10,000, again in the dorsal nerve of the glans clitoris. This overabundance of nerve endings, taste buds, and other sensory gifts reveals that men and women alike are designed to experience the beautiful, including the beauty of sex. Unquote. I think this is an important message for women to hear, because, and for men to hear as well about women, because the message we often get, especially in the church, is that sex is mostly for the man. You know, women don't really desire sex much. And so sex is just for the man he just has his urges, he gets revved up, he redlines, and he just needs his release. So wives, if you love your husband, you'll give that to him. And that's kind of the message we present in certain conservative evangelical churches, very fundamentalist types often, is this message I hear a lot. And we neglect that women also are designed for pleasure in sex. But it's going to require more work of the husband to help her receive that, to experience it. So, but actually the other thing I want to touch on here is immediately when I read that first sentence, much like taste buds, the design of our genitalia stands as a witness. So immediately that made me think of Christopher West, who so often points out that the root of the words testes and testicles is the same root word as testament, testimony, and testify. Our genitals are meant to tell a story. The story of who God is and our destiny with Him, and that God made us sexed beings, both human but different in an essential complementary way. And this reveals something about God, that He is an everlasting communion of life-giving love. And that reveals to us that we are different but meant to connect with Him. And so that's our destiny to join with Him, to participate in the life of the Trinity as the bride of Christ. We're also meant to tell a story by continuing God's work of creation, of bringing order to chaos in reality, of taking things that are not yet formed and not yet habitable and making them habitable and making them a blessing for others. That's the mission given to Adam when God first made him. Go. There's no fruit growing in this garden. It needs to be cultivated. So go. The animals, I created them, but they don't have names. Go. Give them names. bring more order to this creation that I just made, continue my work of ordering everything. And so Adam does that, but he needs a partner to do it fully. This reinforces the big theme in Jolman's book, that our sexuality is storied. What arouses us and what we desire is intricately connected to our personal stories. But not just our stories, the whole story of humanity. But he gets into that more in the conclusion. For the most part, the emphasis is on knowing your own personal story and how that impacts your sexuality. Contrary to the sexual orientation paradigm that the world offers, this idea that everyone is born with built-in sexual proclivities that cannot change, the fact is our sexual arousal templates are learned. I address this more in my video on dismantling the sexual orientation paradigm. I love that he gives special attention to the concept of sensuality. This is something that I've been trying to get out there more and more to help educate others to the difference between sexuality and sensuality and how we have to actually understand sensuality but also embrace it. So I get into that in the series I did, a year and a half ago on what is love, in which I did mostly a commentary on Carol Wojtyła's book, Love and Responsibility. Wojtyła goes into the ingredients of love: attraction, arousal, desire, and goodwill. And as those ingredients, those elements integrating, that becomes marital love. Jolman provides really helpful distinctions when it comes to sensuality and sexuality and sin. First, there's arousal. The call is for men to live an aroused life, but right there, that idea probably triggers you. So he has to explain that general arousal is simply a body state of being awake, embodied, regulated, present, and alive to the moment. It's an involuntary physiological response to stimuli. The word arousal derives from the medieval falconry term for the act of a bird shaking its feathers and rousing itself to life. Arousal involves activation of your brain on every level, and it turns on all your sensory organs and awakens desire, mobility, and readiness. Sexual arousal is a subtype of arousal, the arousal of the erogenous zones in response to the sexual values of the other. Now, I'm sort of throwing in some more of the terminology used from Wojtyła in Love and Responsibility. So that's exactly what he talks about in his book. Now, some arousal is toward awe, wonder, admiration, not to mention danger or threat. So when I'm explaining to clients about anxiety and anger, I explain to them about fight or flight or threat reactions. And when you're activated in your sympathetic nervous system, you experience arousal. It's not necessarily sexual arousal. However, sexual activity is also a sympathetic nervous system activity, or to some degree. So arousal just means you're alert, you're awake, you're activated. It's not always sexual. And we must be clear, arousal is different from lust. It can lead to lust if your heart moves you there, but it can also move you to reverence and awe. See, awe is an expansive feeling in the body. It's a reverence for the power and transcendence of beauty. Awe is the emotional response to beholding beauty. It's an expansive feeling in the body. It's the reverence for the power and transcendence of what one beholds. As some researchers say, awe is on the upper reaches of pleasure and on the boundary of fear. When he said that, it reminded me of the experience that people call being in a flow state, where you're at the edge of your ability, but there's a risk of failure. And so that's awe. There's something awesome about like when someone is surfing a wave and he's like right at the edge of risk and he could fail at any moment, or doing a really good skateboarding trick, or If you're playing a video game, you're like doing really good, but boy, there's all this stuff coming at you, and at any moment you could fail. So it's like there's excitement, but also risk involved. That's You're in a flow state at those moments, and that's touching on beauty. It's a an experience of awe to some extent. Why beauty evokes awe is because there is power in beauty. I think about my wife. I can pick on her real quick. My wife grew up in the inner city, and so she never really got to see the stars much. We get married, she moves out the country, or suburbs at least, and it's actually several years into marriage. She let me in on a secret that when she sees the moon, and when I would point out constellations to her, she would feel fear. And there's something about the beauty, the transcendence of it all, and how big it is and how small we are in comparison. It would bring a sense of fear in her. And yet, she's fascinated with it at the same time. Her fascination has grown even more, especially after we've gone to Cherry Springs State Park one year for our anniversary. That's in Pennsylvania. It's one of the international dark sky zones where there's enough decrease of light pollution that you can see the stars really clearly and brightly. Maybe on a good night, you can even see the Milky Way, some of the nebula clouds. And so that sparked more of an appreciation. That's awe. I've done videos on this where when it's a really beautiful day, I just don't want it to end. I'm in such awe of the beauty of creation. My wife and I joke with her that when it's a really nice day, it just gets me angry because I don't want it to end. I'm like, oh, it doesn't get you so angry? It fills me with so much wonder. When I go to a park, I'm like a big kid. So there's there's so many examples of awe. I love watching videos of sharks, of snakes. In the wild, I'd get terrified to see a shark or a snake, but I want to see it. I want to get close to danger. I love watching videos of people doing parachuting and flight suits, and yet I'm probably going to be terrified if I try that. But one day I really want to. I want to go skydiving someday. I don't know if I'll be able to handle it, but something about being on the edge. So that's awe. One of the interesting things that he mentions in the book is that you can never have too much awe. See, when you engage in porn or sexual addiction or any sort of addiction, you reach a tolerance level. And so you need to up the ante. You need to make it more kinky or more dangerous, more to increase the sense of risk associated with it. Because you're actually not risking anything when you're doing porn. You're abusing someone else, or you're living vicariously through someone else. But you're not taking the actual risk of intimacy. In relationship with others, there's awe that comes from vulnerability, of being truly seen. And you don't get a tolerance to that. The more you engage in experiences that bring up awe, the more you crave more awe. Lust, however, is an obsession over very specific body parts or fantasies. Instead of having an expansive feeling in the body, one's focus narrows. Instead of beholding the whole person, the spirit and the body together, you disintegrate the person. You break them down into just the parts that bring you pleasure, and you discard the rest. You're not treating that person as a whole person when you engage in lust and fantasy over them. And whereas other aspects of sensuality are involuntary physiological responses to stimuli, lust is not involuntary. You do not accidentally lust. It's an act of the will. It's an act of desire. It's the choice to use someone or something as merely an object for personal gratification of the sexual urge or craving. It distorts or reduces one's experience of the person, reducing them to just an object for your pleasure. Like I was saying, in Love and Responsibility, Lust disregards the personhood of the other. It just breaks them down into parts. Whether it's a physical part, or maybe how this person treats you, or what you can get from that person. So in same-sex attraction, it may be, oh, the person's masculinity. If I can get that man's masculinity and absorb it into my own, then I'll be complete as a man, and maybe something like that. Heterosexual fantasy may be, if I can get this woman's approval and her admiration of me, then that makes me fulfilled as a man. There's so many different ways in which we're using the other, not just their body, but even the way in which we fantasize about them relating to us. Lust stops at the pleasure that beauty elicits. But the pleasure that beauty stirs in the body is meant to stir the heart to love, not to lust. Jolman says on page 144, lust requires an act of the will. Even where it is habit, there is participation in the choice to join contempt to relieve shame somewhere. It's angry as much as it's sexual. It could be understood as sexualized anger. Unquote. Lust possesses beauty as if it belongs to you. It consumes not to delight and to give love, but rather to grow in ego. It's only thinking of yourself. So as I often say, the posture of love is to give, but the posture of lust is to take. One of the other important distinctions that Jolman makes is that arousal and desire do not always match. And when that's the case, when there's a mismatch of arousal and desire, that's what we call arousal non-concordance. Why is this important? Because many of the men I work with, they find themselves aroused, meaning they're having an involuntary physiological reaction despite their desires, despite their values, despite what they really want in their life. They're having an unwanted arousal experience, an unintentional, involuntary arousal experience. The world will tell them, oh, that's just who you are, that you are a particular sexual orientation based on your arousal. And you just need to accept that. It's a shallow, surface level answer. There's no curiosity and no depth in what the world has to offer. But when you can help men understand that, okay, desire is different from arousal, well, that also frees them from the guilt from other messages, such as from within the church, what I call the mortification stream or the purity culture approach, that says, you have same-sex arousal, that means you have same-sex desires, that you desire it, and you need to repent of the desire. It's like, I don't want these attractions, I don't want this arousal. And yet you're telling them they need to repent when they haven't done anything, they haven't chosen those desires. And in a lot of the cases, they do not desire it. They have an arousal experience, and it doesn't match with what they really desire. So when they can make that distinction, that can help reduce and eliminate a lot of illegitimate shame and false guilt. You can understand that just because you have an arousal experience, that does not mean that's what you actually desire. Jolman also criticizes our tendency to refer to sex as a drive, making the point that a bodily drive is necessary for survival. Now, in Love and Responsibility, Carol Wojtyła says that it's out of our need for the other that the sexual urge emerges. So there is a need that's buried deep down within the sexual urge itself, but it's more of an existential need for all of humanity, not for you as an individual necessarily. I don't need sex. I can survive without it. Sometimes it's tough if, say, we miss a week or a few weeks because of illness or who knows what else, travel. And so it can get so intense it feels like a need. But no man ever died from not having sex. You can survive it. Therefore, sex is a desire, not a need. The danger in viewing sex as a need is that men treat the sexual urge as one they must answer and that they are powerless to control. So it actually makes it easier for them to just simply give in to compulsions and to rage against their body. How dare I have this need? I can't help this. And they they develop so much shame over an arousal experience because they think that every arousal experience must be answered, must be met with some sort of action, some sort of compulsion to relieve themselves of the feelings of arousal. This approach then precludes being curious, and it puts men in a survival reaction mode that Jolman describes. If you view this as a need that's emerging every time you feel arousal, then you're going to have a sense of fight or flight, a threat reaction. And so you're going to think, I need to do something about this. I need to meet this urge. I need to meet this need, or else I won't survive. I can't handle this. So instead, what I do is I train my clients in mindfulness, in having mastery of what they pay attention to and how to self-regulate, as well as to reach out to others for support and help when they need it. So they can have less shame about the feelings that they're having, but also have mastery of their bodies. To know that, oh, just have this feeling, this urge, or this arousal, I don't need to do anything with it. I don't need to answer its call. However, I'm interpreting that call. Now, if sexuality is rooted in awe, which is characteristic of childlike innocence, then sex, ultimately, is meant to be play. Jolman says, if romance is the adventure of love, then sex is love at play. Unquote. Like playing a game, sex is the dance of separate teams engaging in mutual enjoyment. Like a play on stage, all sex follows a script. Jolman further defines the qualities of childhood play, which must be reintegrated with sexuality. Play is reverent. Like, when children play in a game, they actually take it quite serious. Yes, it's for fun, but they take it serious, and it's a sacred time. Calls to mind right now is one of my favorite movies growing up, The Sandlot, about the boys who have they get together during the summertime, they play baseball. I mean, that speaks to my heart so much because of what I so longed for. I longed for boys in my neighborhood that I can just play games with. I lived in the middle of the country and we're just surrounded by farms. So there's no kids in my neighborhood. And so I was doing a paper on the Sandlot as part of an assignment for a group therapy class. And I was watching the DVD of The Sandlot, and in the special features, they were interviewing some of the boys, and one of them referred to The Sandlot, referred to the baseball field in which they were playing in as like their temple, as like their sanctuary. Like they're using holy and reverent terms for it. So this brings that to mind. There's something, we approach play with reverence. It's serious. And play actually is quite important for development. Children, especially younger ages, they engage in play to try on different roles, to practice something before it may actually be necessary for them to do it. It's also freely chosen. You don't force people to play. They want to do it. So there's consent that must be involved in play. It requires a proper setting. You don't just go and do it anytime. You don't start playing during a funeral. You don't play just as you don't start having sex with your wife in a church service or in public. No, there's set aside places and times. And there are rules. There's rules to play. Both parties aren't going to enjoy it if both parties aren't following particular rules. And I love this, that he points out that play is a mixed neurological state, blending sympathetic nervous system activation with parasympathetic soothing. Well, this is exactly what I'm talking about when I talk about the self states, and then I map those on to polyvagal theory, and I look at that squiggly line that is right above homeostasis, that state of resting and digesting. And there's a squiggly line that goes up into sympathetic nervous system activation and down into homeostasis and then back up. And I tell people that's the self state of assertion. Well, that's play. Because when you play, there's a little bit of risk and then there's fun, there's relief. Risk and relief, but it's not like life or death risk. It's on the lighter end. I used as an example one time doing a presentation on the self states that I like to play Minesweeper on my phone. Not the most exciting game, but there's still a little bit of risk. I might hit this button and the space, and there might be a bomb, and I'll lose the whole game. So yes, that's that squiggly line. That's the assertion self-state. That's play. And play is not just a means to an end, it's the objective of sex itself. Dan Allender says that love is the giving and receiving of pleasure to the glory of God. The world tends to reduce sex just to the pleasure itself or to other goods that you may get out of sex, like power, manipulation of the other person. But that's not mutual play. That's not within the rules that God created sex to be taking place in. On the other hand, in certain religious circles, sex has been reduced to just being about procreation, to the point where you just got to procreate and just be stoic about it, be real puritanical about it. Don't try to enjoy it too much. In fact, even the procreation may even be a bit sinful because you're passing down original sin to another person, the baby that may be conceived through that act, according to Augustine. So we got so much hang up around sex. We understand it as play, and that yes, there are rules for play. That is the end in itself. That for us to enjoy it is to give and receive love, and that glorifies God. With these definitions established, chapters 4, 5, and 6 serve as guides to exploring one's personal story regarding sexuality, particularly how one's sexual story went askew. See, sex education is not some lecture about reproduction and sexual morality. It is always an embodied experience of myriad stories forming one's sexuality. Quote, we aren't simply informed, but are rather formed in our imagination, our relationship to our bodies, and our view of others, unquote. A mature man must be alive in the areas of embodiment, attachment, and sexuality. The purity culture approach to unwanted sexual attractions just settles for abstinence, as if that alone is the goal of sexual maturation. Like I hear this all the time. Well, what is holy sexuality? It's chastity and singleness and faithfulness in marriage. And that's it. If you just meet that requirement, well, I'm chaste in my singleness. I am faithful to my wife. As if that is being sexually mature. There's so much more to that. We stop ourselves short when we think that that is it. So we see this settling with both side B, the accommodation approach, the resist column, as well as side Y, the mortification stream, the purity culture approach, the renounce column, when it comes to approaches in the church for dealing with same-sex attraction or eroticization. They don't look deeper into the meaning of sexuality in general, let alone deeper with curiosity into their own stories. So they miss out on exploring the fullness of sexual development. They especially hinder themselves when they conflate sensuality with lust, so they end up shutting down their connections to their bodies. This was well demonstrated in my commentary on the James White versus Gregory Cole's debate on gay Christian identity. So let's explore those three areas in which a sexually mature man, must be alive in order to be a good lover. Embodiment. You need to be able to live well in your body, to be okay with being aroused, in fact, to enjoy arousal. Like we talk about in Theology of the Body, you need to accept the reality that you are your body. You're not your spirit, like that's the true you, and the body is just a shell that you're stuck inside until you die. It's not a prison for the soul. That's a Gnostic perspective, a dualistic, Manichaean perspective. No, you are your body and you are your soul. You are your spirit. A human is a body-spirit composite, the two united. And I love what Sam says here, quote, "You exist as a body now, and you will exist as a resurrected body for eternity. God made your body, and it still carries that original blessing," unquote. Your body is also where you get your identity. We need a stable reality to ground our identity. And it can't just be in your thoughts, in your subjective experience, your feelings. No, identity, we need to come back to an understanding that identity is objective. And so your sexual identity is determined by your body. I like that Sam Jolman addresses that, however brief, but it's important to start with this. Quote, "Your body is born sexed, by which I mean children are born male or female with the kit to match. Some of us come to feel like a foreigner in our own body, as if it has betrayed us or doesn't feel like a place we belong. Many things can rob us of the freedom and innocent joy of feeling alive in our bodies." So we need to be very compassionate to those who have some sort of incongruence or discordance between their subjective experience and the reality of their bodies. But we must not let that emotional or subjective experience determine who they really are. In fact, who they really are helps guide us to best care for those who are struggling in this area. And we need to also protect children from being exposed to all sort of distorted messages about sexuality before they're ready. Like that he says this, quote, "Children are born sexed, but not sexually awakened. That happens later at puberty, when a boy is born into a man. While children may not be sexually awakened, they are wildly sensual," unquote. So this goes right against the narrative that we get from the world and the sexual revolution, especially people like Alfred Kinsey, who said that children are born sexual and born meant to experience sexual pleasure. So he had no problem, basically in part of his experiments, molesting babies. And that mentality is still what pervades our public school system's sex education programs, and why they have no problem with having books in grade school as young as kindergarten promoting the ideas of masturbation and all sorts of sexual play and experimentation and sexual identity, all this stuff, before children are even developmentally ready for it. So we need to protect kids from being sexualized. However, we do need to honor and celebrate that we are sensual and that our senses are good. And if we just inadvertently experience pleasure from our genitalia when we're before puberty, before we're mature enough to really actually engage sexually, and we're not in that context, but just as children, they experience sexual pleasure through sensual pleasure through their sexual organs, we need not shame them because it's just an innocent exploration of their body. And also need not make a big deal of it so that they become more encouraged in that either, but just to enjoy it for what it was and appreciate all the ways in which their body produces pleasure, while helping them contain that and foster maturity in how they experience it until they're more mature. Engagement with our bodies helps us listen to and befriend them, a process called interoception. So interoception is your capacity to detect in your body how you feel your feelings, how you feel your emotions. This is so critical because so many of the guys I work with with sexual struggles have very poor interoception. They're so disconnected emotionally. That's probably the reason why they are engaging in some sort of sexual sin, because it's one way they've learned that they can actually feel something. It's used then as a way to self-regulate. They need to get back in touch with their body so that they can discover other innocent ways of feeling safe, excited, joyful, connected, instead of always sexual. And so this brings us to the second area, attachment. Attachment is the way we give and receive love on a daily basis with the people most important to us. Your style of attaching with others is formed early in life by your your primary caregivers, your mother and your father, especially mother. And that becomes your template that you then use for other relationships, the ones that are closest to you. So that it's not just a matter of how you relate to your people in your life presently, but rather you have a feeling of love that's carried with you from the past. So, quote, attachment is the carried feeling of love, a feeling of love that gets in and sticks with you. It's the rhythm of connecting in close proximity and then adventuring out into life apart from each other, all while carrying each other's love in our hearts. It's how our relationships breathe. So a securely attached person goes through a rhythm of close proximity, connection, and then separation. And that just becomes a normal rhythm of life, of your routine. So when you first bond with mother, you realize that, I can trust someone to meet my needs. And the fact that someone is attentive and attuned to me means that I do have needs and I do have value. And then as you develop more capacities, you grow to integrate that nurture that you receive. So you learn how to do nurture and soothing for yourself, but never to a point where you're completely independent. So you always need someone who's going to be your secure base that you run back to as you venture out into the world. You return back, even just for a moment, so that you can get that extra boost of nurture that you need, of affirmation. And the person is well attuned to you. They give you enough space, and then they give you the attention when you need it to the degree that you need. They base it on what you need, not what they want for you. So a securely attached person both self-regulates and reaches out for help. As well as when it comes to others, both respects others' boundaries and reaches out to help them. These attachment styles and behaviors that form early in life, through infancy, through early childhood, at least before puberty, become the template that then gets eroticized after puberty. Our sexual relationships, how we relate to others romantically and sexually, is based on these attachment patterns. One researcher, Emily Nagoski, says, sex is an attachment behavior. And Jolman adds, sex is built on the bedrock of emotional connection, and the fruit of sex is a deeper emotional bond, unquote. So a little extra commentary for guys with same-sex attraction. See, one of the things we talk about in reintegrative therapy is that your typical so-called straight guy, I don't like using the term straight or gay, but your so-called straight guy, one who's never had any same-sex attraction, he typically will first have sexual feelings for a woman that he's attracted to, and then as he bonds with her more, those feelings become more romantic, and then they'll go through feelings of warmth and affection, and then friendship. So it starts with a sexual feeling. If there's a pull, that something about her sexual values that he's drawn to at an unconscious level first. With women, it's typically the other way around. Friendship, and then affection, and warmth, and romance, and sexual feelings. Not always, but that's very common for women to not have the sexual feelings as immediately. Also, it's the case that with most guys who have a background of being exclusively attracted to the same sex, as they go through their healing journey and they start to explore opposite-sex relationships, that it's not going to go the same way as guys who never had same-sex attraction, where they're going to first feel sexual feelings for a woman and then it will evolve to friendship. For these guys, it's usually going to start with more an emotional connection. They'll probably start with having friendship feelings, and then affection, and warmth, and romance, and then sexual feelings, and maybe even in a marriage, they have to build up to having sexual feelings before they can engage in intercourse with their wives, where they have to build up a time of connecting emotionally before they're even ready to engage sexually. And so it's very common for the men I work with who are dealing with same-sex attraction to assume that they're defective as men because they're not immediately sexually aroused by women. When they learn that their path to sexual arousal with a woman is through emotional connection, they still get discouraged because they've internalized a narrative that real men are instantly turned on and don't need emotional intimacy to get aroused. And so they shame themselves. They internalize this feeling of shame. Oh, because I don't get erect, I don't get aroused right away when I see a woman who's like half naked or in a bikini, even if it's my wife. They think there's something wrong with them. And it's helpful for them to understand that all men need emotional connection. Even if they first get those sexual feelings, they still need the emotional connection. Because that's what's going to keep that relationship thriving and building more. And gosh, yes, I could be pretty much ready to go with my wife at any moment, sure. But you know what really gets me most in the mood? When I just spend the day with her. When we're just having a good time together. When we're playing together. When we sit down, we play a video game together. Or we go for a walk. And just enjoy each other's company. It brings, that connection just makes you want to get even more intimate and closer to her. Jolman quotes from Sue Johnson, an innovator in emotion-focused therapy, quote, "Males may be particularly vulnerable to touch hunger. From birth, boys are held for shorter periods and caressed less often than our girls. As adults, men seem to be less responsive to tender touch than our women. But in the men I see, they crave it just as much as do the women." Unquote. I see this a ton with my clients. They crave to be hugged and held, but they have such shame over this longing. On one hand, they need to grieve the loss of the touch they didn't get during the critical periods of childhood. And on the other hand, they need to courageously seek out healthy, appropriate touch from other men, from others in general, their wives, a mentor, peers, who are safe so they won't exploit or objectify each other. As Sam says in this section, to truly make sex an act of love, we need to recover the freedom to give and receive affection. So many men I work with, they like think it's the weirdest thing to express affection, whether it's to their wife or to their buddies. I'll tell them, like, in real time, when you're out with your friends and you're having a good time, tell them, guys, I'm really enjoying myself. This is amazing. And they look at me like I have a third eye. What? Actually say that? Like yeah. Say in real time what you're feeling, how you're experiencing what you're doing. When you're with your wife and you're having a good time, say, I'm having a great time with you right now. And they look at me like it's the weirdest thing. But yet, that's going to be so key to getting to the point where you can actually love. You need to have a freedom to give and receive affection. Physical, verbal, all sorts of ways in which we express affection. And so, of course, the third way in which men need to be alive to be good lovers is their sexual stories. How we greet puberty and the awakening of our sexuality is critical. The sex talk is meant to be an ongoing conversation, unfolding over the entire course of childhood and adolescence, and even into adulthood. And healthy, dignifying, passionate love between father and mother must be observed routinely in the home. Like so many guys I work with, their parents are divorced, or their parents weren't very affectionate with each other, or there was a lot of conflict and fighting in the home. They didn't observe a loving male-female union. How are they going to internalize an idea that it's good to be in marriage, it's good to relate to the opposite sex, when they don't see it demonstrated? I love what Sam writes here, quote, "Our sexuality is meant to be experienced as an awakening. It's designed to rouse itself in its own time, at the pace of our bodies and hearts, through innocence and curiosity and love. As it so desires," says the poet in Song of Songs 8:4. sexuality is made to be felt in our bodies as a form of an adventurous curiosity, full of discovery and intrigue. You are meant to be able to ask all the questions in the world, to be moved and aroused in such a way that your heart and sexual desire could grow up together." Unquote. Unfortunately, precisely because the awe associated with innocent sexuality draws us to worship our Creator, evil has its own agenda for our sexual formation: to write all your arousal scripts to end in shame and fear. Jolman explores the many ways in which attachment loss, sexual abuse, and other childhood wounds, replete with client case examples, produce sexual arousal templates that conflict with one's values and virtues. Even what seems like just plain old lust, Jolman makes the case that shame is at the root. He describes a time he's part of a work crew, and all the men started gawking at college girls walking down the block. They weren't seeing the girls as persons, but as body parts. Like I was talking about before, in Love and Responsibility, we're called to love a whole person, not a body disintegrated from the whole. It's common to suggest that these guys just had sinful hearts and they need accountability. They just need to repent and be accountable. But he says, quote, "This would be a shallow view of both sin, as if it can be solved via mere behavior modification, and the human heart, as if it's only sin-driven. What's going on here is much deeper than that. Though you wouldn't know it from their composure, these men were escaping something. In the very act of gorging their eyes on body parts, they were trying to flee their shame." Unquote. He explains more, quote, "I am convinced every sexual sin a man struggles with always involves some form of anxious soothing. We call sexual sin carnal or of the flesh, but we fail to consider the actual flesh and blood body that factors into it. There is some form of fight, flight, or freeze in every sexual sin we commit. And I believe all of these are a form of sexualized anger and contempt, too, a revenge on something or someone. And if we don't address this mad search for relief and revenge, and the shame that provokes it, we won't ever make sense of our sexual struggles. We end up repenting of having a body outright, rather than forsaking our contempt to find healing for our trauma and shame. I believe nearly every pornography and masturbation ritual is, first and foremost, an attempt at soothing a dysregulated, anxious nervous system." Unquote. This is exactly what I've been teaching when I use Nicolosi's self-state model. And it's my main criticism for so many discipleship programs out there for men with sexual sin struggles, whether heterosexual or homosexual. There's oftentimes a complete neglect of the body and emotions. Now, all that Sam and I are saying here doesn't excuse men for their sin, but if this sin is of the flesh, if it is carnal, then we need to understand how our bodies work so we can actually regulate and then have mastery and self-control. We're told to have the fruit of self-control, but we're not trained well by our churches, sadly, in how to acquire such self-control, because we punish the body. We sort of treat the body as if it's a villain instead of a guide to your healing. Sam says, quote, "We think living with innocent wonder got us in trouble, so we aim our harm at the lover within. I dare say no one chooses contempt with the full awareness of what they are choosing, but somewhere along the way we move from automatic response to willful participation. We escape the threat of exposure, if even for a minute, and our agony dissipates. Further, lust of the eyes is not too much sexual desire, it's too little reverence, too little awe. We replace appreciation for beauty with the weapon of objectification. Once we kill off our innocent openness to beauty, we're left with something that feels heartless." He goes on, quote, "Beauty threatens the ego. And the egoist faced with beauty chooses domination rather than risking being undone. Being undone. Uh, in the interview he does with Drew Boa on Husband Material, they talk about orgasms as being undone. There's a vulnerability in sex, in the orgasm experience. So when you're using porn, you're bypassing all that vulnerability. The only one who's vulnerable is the one on the screen. The ones you're harming through the porn, the one you're harming through promiscuity, through having hookups. Ultimately, you're harming yourself. I mean, Scripture says that he who sins sexually sins against his own body. I'm going to continue. Sex paradoxically becomes for these men a way to avoid intimacy, not find it. By getting a lot of sex, some men soothe the fear or insecurity they feel. This is desperate or demanding sex. This is where sex can actually feel like a need. But the real need is to soothe their inner insecurity. I find that this applies to homosexuality in a unique way. They've sexualized their longing for same-sex attention, affection, approval, etc. because they're terrified of seeking the genuine version of healthy, non-sexual intimacy. He goes much more in depth with contempt and contempt-driven sexuality and shame-driven sexuality. I don't want to give the whole book away, so please read it. It goes into some really good, important aspects, especially sexual abuse and all sorts of sexual sin and how it does damage to ourselves, to others, and the world. In the final 2 chapters, Jolman offers the keys toward sexual maturation and healing. They're both theological and practical. God wants men to recover the original blessing of innocence and awe for which he's made them. Innocence, it just means that the childlike wonder in which a child approaches the world, the capacity for beholding and appreciating beauty. That's innocence, the capacity for awe. And that's the very heart that Jesus tells us we must have if we're to enter the kingdom of heaven. Sam says, quote, anything less than an alive and related heart just won't ever sit well in us. We will always want intimacy, freedom and wholeness, true virility and aliveness. And even when you cannot or will not want it for yourself, even then, God will never stop wanting it for you. Unquote. God desires for us to be unashamed in our nakedness and glory in our vulnerability. Jolman points to Jesus' demonstration of God's kindness as the cure to our shame. Our instinct is to escape shame through contempt. The alternative is to receive kindness from God and others, and to show kindness to ourselves. This starts with pausing our reactions, quite literally, and breathing. Use the body, as God gave it to you, to regulate. Calm down the threat reaction systems in your body. Instead of shutting down into a shame state, stay attuned and alive to the body, which requires vulnerability and courage. Staying present to oneself when in a state of arousal is an act of compassion that avoids the pitfalls of pity and self-medicating with sin. This kindness leads to repentance, as one shows curiosity about one's sin and follows that with self-compassion. And this is exactly what we do in reintegrative therapy. In fact, one of our protocols, the standard reintegrative protocol, usually involves mindful self-compassion, where you picture your younger self at the root to that, as we trace back the arousal to an unmet need, a deficit, or a wound, and you identify that younger self that's implicated in that wound, you show self-compassion. You visualize yourself caring for that younger self. And so that's how God brings healing. He does that work through the session, through the work we do, or in his own miraculous ways. I love when I have a client comes to me and says, I had an experience in between our session and now. And it was just totally God. I didn't do anything. Those are the best. So as we show curiosity and compassion to ourselves, we then need to reawaken and keep awake our capacity to be moved by beauty. This is what resurrects innocence. Since innocent awe is at the heart of play, cultivating a life of awe develops and matures the lover within oneself. Men must embrace the aroused life, being embodied, regulated, and present. This goes beyond sexuality. In their efforts to combat sexual sin, men have dissociated from sensuality. All of life is sensual, which is the generator of sexuality. Jolman declares, quote, "I'm inviting you to live an aroused life as an act of self-love and self-nurture. The sex talk you never got left you neglected, exposed, wounded, and yes, immature. It's time you rise to fight for the goodness of your sexual self." Unquote. One of the common things I tell my clients is you need to start doing things that bring joy and delight into your life. To get out of that, what we call the gray zone, where that's the state in which we then act out compulsively. To get out of that, you need to activate yourself. You need to get out of this consummatory posture and start doing things that require some effort but are enjoyable. You need to live. You need to get in touch with your emotions. See, oftentimes these guys get terrified or ashamed of their sexual feelings. They think they're using a sniper rifle to kill these sexual feelings that they have, but you can't use a sniper rifle when it comes to emotions. So what they think is a sniper rifle is actually a bazooka. And so there's a global effect on their emotions when they try to kill one aspect. You end up killing your capacity for joy, for love, for enthusiasm, excitement, motivation. When I work with these guys who are terrified of their sexuality and their sexual feelings, they are just distraught and so confused, and they are frustrated, constantly irritable, because they're like in desperation. They don't know how to just live. So you need to get back online, feel your feelings again. That's what we call the self states. An effective self state is one in which you're feeling and dealing, not shutting down the emotions, not shutting down arousal. You're feeling the arousal, and then you're dealing with it. If it's one that needs to be addressed in any way, you just need to sit there and experience it. Like one of my recent clients, I told him, before you do anything with your arousal, try to see how long you just sit in it, and even enjoy it. Enjoy the feeling of arousal that comes on unexpectedly. You don't have to act on it. You don't have to try to suppress it. You don't have to try to change it, and you don't need to use it to lead to some sort of pornography or masturbation. Just sit in it and see if you can just tolerate that and enjoy it. If it gets overwhelming, then you can do some exercise to redirect your attention. But see if you can just feel your feelings. It's so vital. So many of the guys I work with are so emotionally dissociated. Even among those who are proclaiming an ex-gay identity, it is common to observe a pervasive shutdown of sensuality altogether, rather than an embrace of the aroused life. Many of these men continue in quiet desperation, never getting activated as lovers, even if they do enter into a natural, meaning a heterosexual marriage. Their innocence has been buried in shame, and they miss out on the keys of curiously learning from their stories, employing self-compassion, and cultivating daily experiences of awe to stir forth their lover within. These guys need to get back online with their emotions. They need to feel again, to be alive. It's quite ironic, really. The men I work with grew up with being told that they're weak, they're wimpy, they're emotional, they're big babies, they're crybabies, all this stuff. Those are the insults that were thrown at them by their fathers, by big brothers, by bullies at school or in the neighborhood. But the reality is they're actually most often quite emotionally shut down. They're not crybabies. They're very out of touch with their emotions. And this annoys a lot of clients, but for these clients, my first task with them is developing their emotional awareness. Some they get very frustrated with me, like, I had one guy who's a doctor, he's a medical doctor. And when he would bring up a fantasy or we go into a memory, I'd ask him, how do you feel? And he would give me maybe a word for an emotion. But I'd ask him, okay, go into your body. How does that feeling, that arousal feel? How does that fear feel? That anxiety feel? Go into your body. How does it feel in your body? He'd be puzzled. He's confused. Doesn't know what I mean by that. And he even talked to doctors at work. Is it normal to feel your feelings in your body? And I'm like, some of the doctors were confused by that question too. I'm like, oh my gosh, you guys are so cerebral. You're supposed to be doctors. You should know how emotions are the body's dashboard for the soul. They're felt. You need to feel your feelings. You're so disconnected. Like a one client who, when I ask him how he feels, he goes on a dictionary. He goes online. He types in words. He's trying to find words for emotions. He doesn't know. He's so emotionally illiterate. And so we hunker down. We spend a lot of time there on developing emotional awareness. And that can annoy a lot of clients, but it's important work. We're not going to get far if we don't do that work. Because attraction, whether same-sex attraction or some other fetish issue or some other sexual addiction issue, is an emotional issue. It cannot be addressed just with changing behavior and beliefs, just with becoming more convicted about your sin. No, you've got to address the emotions. This conflation of the feelings of arousal with sin itself is what I believe is at the root of such fear and OCD among people in the church with same-sex attraction, or people without same-sex attraction, but that fear their non-sexual arousal being SSA. In my video with Michael Gasparo about same-sex attraction and OCD, we touched on how one of the roots of OCD is an aversion to sensed goods. For example, a man has a longing to connect with other guys, and it feels so uplifting when he gets it. Therefore, it must be a perversion in his skewed view. So he suppresses the longing. But sanctioning these longings to the shadows only makes them more appealing. So his obsession increases. After the last chapter, he actually has another final chapter, the conclusion. And he concludes with casting a vision for how men can heal and protect the whole world when they embrace the masculine call to love. God created men to reflect his image and honor the dignity of each person. God did not create sex to be a tool for power, escape, or irreverence. He created it to be a vehicle for love. When men live and relate with innocence, which is neither ignorance nor pure sinlessness, but awe and wonder, combined with shrewdness, with wisdom, men can confront evil with courage. The lover within, which promotes the good of others. Remember, to love is to will the good of the other, as Thomas Aquinas says. The lover within is the engine to write a better story for oneself and the whole of humanity. So that's why I find his breakdown of the different terms, arousal and desire and lust and sexual arousal versus general arousal, I found those all very helpful. And I hope this helps you guys. Please, get the book. I'm giving an overview here, but you'll get so much more when you read it for yourself and you reflect yourself on your own life and your own story. Your stories of embodiment, attachment, sexual development. So be curious about yourself. Let the Lord do his work in bringing healing and integration and maturation. So, if you got anything from all this, drop a comment. Like, subscribe, share this with others. Until next time, please know that Jesus loves you freely, fully, faithfully, and fruitfully.